Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the last presentation of the day of this BA Excellence Conference event. My name is Francisco. I'm from EPAM, Portugal, and I'm proud to present you Emal. Emal is from Toronto, Canada, and is a senior business analyst and business architect with extensive experience in both waterfall and agile methodologies. He was delivered more than 20 projects and holds a master's degree in the information systems, a bachelor's degree in information technology, and a post-diploma in software and database development. He's also the founder of BAblocks.com to teach business analysts to the next generation of BA professionals. Welcome, Emal. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm here to share with you the latest key findings that we have discovered through the joint research project that we at BA Blocks are working on with our research partners from Herd Consulting. And so I do want this to be an interactive approach, and hopefully we will have some interactions as we're going through questions coming up. Feel free to put everything in the chat, and we'll have Francisco will come out and help us get access to some of those questions so that we can work through them. The key finding that I want to share with you today has to do a lot more with the business analysis work than it does with the AI. Because the key findings that we've found so far are that AI is no replacement for judgment, for your experience, for your critical thinking abilities, or for the deep and rigorous business and systems analysis work that you have to do as part of your job. So if there's anything that you walk away with today, that's the key finding. And we're going to get into quite a bit of detail into prompt engineering so that you understand why we believe this is true today. Now, for many people, I think that hearing that AI is not a replacement for our work, it's a cause for celebration, right? Business analysis is not going anywhere, and we all have the opportunity to continue doing the jobs that we love doing. But the other key finding here is that there is some significant risks that are there for business analysts who may not be as experienced or as well trained. And those are the risks that we're going to be focusing on as part of our conversation today, because I think the most important thing that an analyst can do is to adopt AI in a way where they're mitigating those risks. And some of the best practices that I'm going to be sharing with you today, still a work in progress, but these best practices that we're sharing with you today are aimed at helping to mitigate a lot of those risks that exist. All right. So as part of our agenda, our objective is to understand the process that I'm going to share with you so that you as an analyst can make sure that you're maintaining the rigor of analysis and oftentimes of design work that you have to do as an analyst while incorporating ChatGPT into your practices. The example that we're going to use from our playbook is the example of user stories. And so we are going to dive deeply into our user stories and look at some of the guidance that we're putting together for business analysts on how to actually develop user stories, specific instructions on how to develop user stories using ChatGPT. I do also have some resources available where if you're more interested in learning how to use ChatGPT to do more technical things like SQL queries, I'll show you where you can get access to that resource after when we get close to the end. A little bit more about our research. So we have partnered with a company coming out of the UK called Herd Consulting. And Herd Consulting is basically a team of very highly experienced business analysts that are doing quite a bit of client work with the UK government currently and with a number of other clients. But myself, as the founder of BA Blocks, and Richard Harrison, who is a principal consultant at Herd, are really spending quite a bit of our own time and resources going through and testing out the tools that are being made available to us. And we're starting to publish the results in what we have titled as the AI Playbook for Business Analysts. And the URL is there, but I'll share more with you about where you can actually get a lot more and start to actually contribute to the research that we're doing. The hope here is that we can start to give very clear, detailed guidance to business analysts on how to adopt AI without really falling victim to many of the risks that exist. All right, that's the overall objective that we have. And we say that we have here, we're saying we have some experienced business analysts. I'll share a little bit of my own experience with you very quickly, just so you can kind of get a sense of where I'm kind of coming from in the research that we're doing. I started studying business analysis in 1999. Not sure how many of you were really around at that time, but I started studying it very early on. And as Francisco mentioned, I've done basically a lot of formal education in business analysis. I first started my BA career in 2005, as soon as I graduated from my master's program. And I've been basically doing nothing since business analysis since 2005. And so we publish a little bit of my career history to give other business analysts an idea of what the different stages of a business analyst career can look like, kind of using my own career as an example. And so there's quite a bit of detail. If you're a younger business analyst and you're just kind of getting into the profession and you want to kind of get a view of what the future of your career might look like, you can kind of use my career as a bit of an example to help you understand that a little bit better. So with all of that said, let's dive right into the subject matter. And so earlier I mentioned about how there are a couple of different risks that exist for business analysts. And the risk of over-reliance is probably by far the biggest risk that you as an analyst are really going to be up against if you're not prepared. And the way that I like to explain this is by using really just like a really simple of how our mind works when it comes to forming opinions based on the information that we receive, right? So if you kind of look at the way that our mind is structured, right? There is usually a lot of information that kind of tries to make its way into our mind and to try to have an effect on the opinions that we form. Now, the way that our mind typically works is that we have, especially as analysts, any information that's coming through here to try to make its way into the back end of our mind here has to go through quite a few obstacles, right, before we adopt information as opinion, right? And so we don't just listen to what somebody says and automatically form our opinions, right? That's, as analysts, our brains just don't work that way. There is a massive amount of experience, of judgment, critical thinking, and again, very deep analysis work that we have to perform to be able to vet what it is that we hear before we form our opinions. And these opinions really are the opinions that our clients, our customers rely on, especially when we're more experienced. Those are the opinions that they rely on to make business decisions or to make technical decisions in their work. And so the opinions that we hold as analysts is incredibly valuable, especially I, as a consultant, I'm oftentimes asked for my opinion on certain very complicated subjects. And I have to be very judicious about the kind of opinions that I hold and the kind of a guidance that I provide to my clients because of the consequences that it can hold. So these opinions here, I don't form my opinions very easily, right? And most business analysts don't either, because of the fact that we have these critical thinking faculties that filters out a lot of the bad information that is really trying to form our opinions. Now, when it comes to over-reliance, one of the risks that we're starting to see is that on the spectrum of trustworthiness of information, we believe that AI falls somewhere kind of in the middle. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. Whenever there are reliable sources of information, or what we've deemed to be reliable sources of information, typically those sources tend to get a lot less scrutiny before they form our opinions, right? So if you, for example, have learned that a person that you respect, a person whose opinions you respect because they've demonstrated to you and they've kind of built up that trust with you, and you now see them as a reliable source, there's a high likelihood that anytime they give you guidance, you're going to do a lot less scrutiny on that because you trust that source, right? And so that reliable source, really like the most reliable source at the top end of the spectrum, is up here, and that requires little scrutiny. Unreliable sources are the total opposite. Anytime there's an unreliable source, they may or may not have true or good information, but you have to perform your due diligence by making sure that you apply your experience, your judgment, critical thinking, all of the faculties that make you a good analyst. Those things have to be applied. AI tools right now, we believe, kind of falls somewhere on the lower end of that spectrum. But some of the tips that I'm going to share with you can actually bump up the reliability of ChatGPT itself. So after this talk, hopefully you'll be in a position where you can use ChatGPT in a way where you yourself are making it more reliable through your own actions. Okay. So that is the one major risk that we're going to try to overcome today. The second risk, I want to actually ask the audience a question, and you can put your answers in the chat and we'll come back to it. But I'll ask you a question about how many of the folks that are listening today were around in the year 2000 when Google started to become popular. And so just go ahead and put your answers in the chat, because for those of you who were around, you'll probably remember that when Google started to get popular, there's this term called just Google it that also kind of started to kind of make its way into the language, everyday language that people are using it. And so now, 23, 24 years later, we say, I'm just going to Google it, right? It's already part of our language. But there was a time, I remember a time when that wasn't the case. And when Google came out, that language came out. But more importantly, it is the thought process behind that language that for us poses a bit of a risk, because this whole idea of the just Google it mentality is now so ingrained in the way that we think, in the way that we function, that we're starting to see a lot of people try to use ChatGPT in the same way that they use Google. And that is, that's a pretty big mistake, if I have to be a little bit blunt about it. And so again, our process is going to help you kind of rewire your brain a little bit, and start using the tool in a way that's going to be effective for you. All right. So for those of you, again, who were around in the 2000s, I hope you're here with me, because I don't want to feel that old. I do remember it. But more importantly, I think it is the language and the thought process behind that. You have to make sure that you're not applying here to ChatGPT. And admittedly, saying, let me ChatGPT that, probably isn't as catchy, which is what this Instagram user here also agrees with. But the thought process is there, and we're starting to see, again, a lot of people trying to use ChatGPT in that way, right? So that usage pattern, the way that it typically works is that somebody will usually just open up ChatGPT, they'll start asking it questions, and essentially the process looks something like this, right? It's very similar to the let me Google it kind of mentality that we have, or that process that we use. But a lot of folks just open up ChatGPT, they submit a request, they extract a response, and then they try to figure out how to integrate it into what it is that they're trying to do, right? That might be a deliverable that you're producing. It might be an email you're trying to write. It could be anything, right? That mentality, again, is going to produce results. I'll show you an example of how a business analyst might use this to try to prompt ChatGPT to get what they want. So our example here, for example, would be, you can go ahead and read it, but let's say our prompt says that we want ChatGPT to start giving us some user stories that we want to put on our product backlog, because we're really on the cusp of starting a CRM implementation project, or a sales reinvention type of project inside of a company, a sales revitalization project, right? There's the likelihood of an untrained analyst or somebody who is still using that just Google it mentality. There's a very high likelihood that they're going to start using it in this way. Now, will this produce results? Sure. It'll give you what you ask it for. You got to understand that ChatGPT specifically is very pleasant and usually doesn't put up a lot of resistance. And so anything you ask it, it'll give you an answer. But is that answer any good is the thing that we should all be thinking about. Because if you take this approach, what's likely to happen is that ChatGPT is going to give you a list of things. And if you, going back to what we talked about earlier, if you just submit your request, you extract a response, and you just start trying to integrate it into your work products, you're kind of falling into a bit of a pitfall that exists in the usage of AI. All right. Now, the alternative to doing this is to take a much more structured approach. And that structured approach is the output of what we're putting out in our AI playbook, to give business analysts very clear guidance on how to produce specific types of deliverables using the usage pattern that we're going to be talking about. And Francisco, if we do have any questions and you feel like there's something relevant to what I'm talking about, feel free to just stop me and ask the question as we're going through. I don't mind answering them as we're going through the workshop here. All right. So the question that we asked, this risky approach, as we like to call it, is that you use the Google it mentality, get an output and try to integrate it. The structured approach, as you're going to see, gives you really our biggest best practice recommendation that we can make, which is that you have to make sure that you split out your interaction into 6 distinct, clearly defined steps. And it may seem like a simple thing, but once you start to see the benefit that it has, you'll realize that the simplicity of a process like this can actually magnify the quality of the output you get by many times over. Okay. And so the 6 steps that we recommend as part of our main guidance right now is that you have to make sure that before you do anything inside of AI, that you clarify your own ask. You have to make sure you understand what it is that you're asking for. And oftentimes just going to a system and typing something like this doesn't necessarily give AI what it needs to give you a good response, because you haven't clarified your ask in an example. And I'll show you an example in just a second. So step number 1 is that we want to make sure that we're clarifying our ask, and then we start to design our prompt. Step number 3 has to do with actually interacting with AI. So you see that we're basically doing 2 steps before we even open up ChatGPT, right? That level of discipline, if you can have that kind of discipline, you start to build up the habits that you need as an analyst to be able to get the results that you want. Step number 4 is to evaluate the response. We don't have we have clear guidance, but we can't share it yet until we continue our research. But you have to make sure that you're applying a lot of those critical thinking skills that we talked about a little bit earlier, to make sure that you're vetting what AI is telling you. And I think we have heard many of our speakers repeat the same message, and I'm going to repeat it again, is that the level of reliability that these tools have today at their current stage needs to be vetted. It's not a trustable source of information. Step number 5 is to make sure that you iterate. And as agile practitioners, we understand the value of iteration. I don't think I have to elaborate on that too much, but we'll see examples. Step number 6 is when you start to finally integrate into your work. And so if you follow this process, you'll start to see that you probably have to go through multiple iterations of this before you can even think about integrating it into your work. And that level of discipline is what you need to start building. And that's why we make this our biggest recommendation, is that the recommendation is a habit forming recommendation that is going to give you the opportunity to think more rigorously at each step. All right. So again, if we do have any questions, yeah, please pop them up. I'm just going to kind of move right through if we don't. Now, as part of the playbook, our goal is to apply this pattern to the major deliverables, the major activities that we perform as business analysts. So we've chosen a relatively easy one. User stories tends to be something that a lot of people are familiar with, but it's a relatively easy use case to try to tackle. And so we started with that, and we started to build some very clear guidance around how you can start generating user stories. And if you start to follow our process, right, instead of opening up ChatGPT and starting to ask it for user stories the way that a novice user might, if you follow our process and clarify your ask, you will start to understand that there's a lot of experience, judgment, knowledge that you have to apply. Our playbook is going to give you some of the main considerations that you have to take into account when you are starting to clarify your ask. And again, the ChatGPT window is nowhere in sight here. Okay, I've started to build the discipline in my own practices to make sure that anytime I need to use AI, it's closed. I need to clarify my ask before I actually go to the tool. And this will, our first release of the playbook will do that for you when it comes to user stories. Bit of a preview. What do we know as analysts? As analysts, we know that we can't just ask for user stories, because we know that user stories typically don't get created in isolation, and they are usually not the first step that we have to go to as part of our work. What is the first step? Role analysis. You cannot get a good, clear set of user stories until you've performed your role analysis. And we really kind of give you some guidance on some of the things that you have to be very explicit about with ChatGPT to make sure that you're doing your role analysis properly. The definition of your epics, right? Your requirements architecture. Have you defined the overall architecture of what it is that you're trying to achieve? And again, if you try to just dive right into the user story level without going through this level of thinking, will you get the job done? Yes, likely. Are you going to be able to do a quality job in a structured way that addresses all of your customers' concerns? Likely not, right? Do your role analysis, define your epics, right? And then you ask for user stories. And so as part of the best practices of clarifying your ask, this is our current recommendation. This may change a little bit between now and when we actually release this. This is a bit of an early preview of the playbook. But when you get down to the user story level, that's really kind of the easier part of things, because the most difficult part oftentimes is usually the role analysis. But when you get down to the user story level, we talk about format and detail, right? There are a lot of different ways you can write your user stories. What is the preference of your team, right? What is the preference of your developers? Are your customers, your stakeholders on the other side of the fence, are they going to be able to understand the format that you're using, right? And so you have a lot of different formats here, but again, you have to clarify which one. There's a level of detail issue that comes out when you are starting to try to use AI in producing this. And I'll show you a very good example of how, when you've clarified your ask using these types of parameters, right? You're not just going to AI to try to lean on it heavily to do your analysis work. Knowing this comes through education, it comes through practice, it comes through experience, right? This is the clarification of the ask that now helps you to build your prompt. And when you get to that step, you'll notice that as soon as we get to step number 2, again, no ChatGPT window anywhere in sight. I personally do all of my prompt engineering inside of Microsoft Word for a couple of different reasons, but you use a text editor. You can use Notepad, whatever tool you have at your disposal. Make sure you haven't opened the ChatGPT window yet, because you start to see that once you've clarified your ask based on experience, knowledge, training, whatever it is that you've done to build this up, you start to see those words appearing inside of your prompt. And so the difference between a prompt like this and just going to ChatGPT and asking it for a list of user stories for your project, you're going to get completely different responses. And I'll show you the response that ChatGPT gave to us based on this in a minute. All right. Overall message here, again, a lot less about the tool, a lot more about your analysis, judgment, right? Forming your opinions, you have to have a very high barrier for how you form your opinions. And again, most analysts do. When you build the discipline to use the tools in the right way, you start to get the right output. Now, in this example, instead of me just going and asking it, you see how much context I would provide. And I'm going to be making this prompt available to you inside of ChatGPT at the end of this. So don't worry don't worry about having to read it all. The overall message here is that there is a lot of context and a couple of tips that I'm going to share with you about what to include and what not to include when you're prompting ChatGPT in the way that we have here. But hopefully, if I was to actually go back, hopefully you're starting to see the difference between this prompt. Before we even get the response, you're starting to see the difference between that prompt and a prompt that a novice user or an inexperienced business analyst might use, right? This is 2 sentences typed directly into the ChatGPT window. The way to properly prompt ChatGPT and possibly future AI systems is to do it in the way that we've described here. I'm not getting any of the comments or the feedbacks, so I'm sure that there are. Francisco, I'll rely on you to stop me. But again, I'll just keep on moving forward. Hopefully, everybody's good with what we've talked about so far. All right, so we talked about the designing of the prompt. Now, a couple of tips that I would give to you in designing your prompt. Again, I've repeated it multiple times as a habit-forming practice. Make sure you don't open ChatGPT first. Brainstorm in Microsoft Word is my preferred tool, but any other tool that you have that lets you focus on clarifying your ask. Second tip is that I would say that you should learn to speak to ChatGPT like a person. Okay, so if I go back to my prompt here, you see that I start kind of, this is the kind of conversation I would have with like a trusted advisor that I'm trying to gain some insight from. And I use language, very conversational language, because you start to see that ChatGPT in your conversational language, you're giving it hints that you might not even necessarily realize that you're giving to it, right? There's so much communication that happens between humans where information exchanges where you might not even realize that you're exchanging that information. But when it's just kind of baked into the way that you speak, right? When you start to speak to ChatGPT, it starts to pick up on some things that you might even not have known, right? And so using natural language, speaking to it like it's a person will oftentimes give you better results. Tip number 3 is that you have to be very clear about your expectations. All right, and we'll look at the prompt again, but in the prompt that I gave it here is that I set a very clear expectation of what it is that I'm looking for. Okay, so I said I'd like to understand the factors that I'm sharing with you. I want you to make sure you're asking me any follow-up questions that you have. And I want you now to guide me through the process until we've ended up with a draft set of user stories that are specifically designed for the situation on our project. Very clear, very specific guidance on what you're looking for. If we compare that again, if we were to go back and compare that to this prompt, can you give me a list of user stories I can put into my backlog? I mean, it's clear, but is it going to achieve results? Not the way that this prompt will. And we've tested this, and I can guarantee you now that this prompt generates a significantly different response than the prompt that we used earlier. All right. Moving on to step number 3 for submitting your request. The only tip that we have for you at this point is that there are some limitations possibly with the tool. There's a whole lot of analysis related stuff that's at this level, but there are some limitations of character limits or word limits that GPT 3.5 has right now. GPT-4 extends that by quite a bit, but if you are using either version of these and your prompt, you've put so much work into your prompt that it becomes very big, you may have to split that out. And again, that is actually a benefit, because when you split it out, it gives you the opportunity to have a more human-like conversation, right? If you can imagine, you don't just approach a person and just give them you don't just tell them everything that you want and then expect for them to reply. There's always kind of like a back and forth between in a real conversation. This limitation is actually a bit of a benefit because it kind of forces you to have that conversation if your prompt gets too long. We're reserving judgment on and we're kind of reserving our guidance on the evaluation, because as experienced analysts, we know how to do it, but to communicate that to the rest of the business analysis community, we are building it out basically as a clear set of things that you should be considering. And so we're not at the point where we're ready to share the evaluation option yet, but this is I would say probably as important as designing your response, because this is really the point. If I was to go back to this image that we talked about here, the evaluation of the responses is really what forms a huge part of you forming a barrier to the bad information that might try to affect your opinions, right? So that evaluation, we are taking our time with it to make sure we do it right. So with all of those things said, I would say that the fifth step of iterating on your ask is key. And I know all of these steps are important, but that's a reason why they're all separate steps. Because if you try to mush them all into one, there's no way that you can really kind of think clearly about how am I going to iterate on my ask. Okay, so I'll use this now to kind of walk you through the response that ChatGPT gave to us using the prompt that we just kind of looked at, right? So as part of iterating our response, you already know that, you know, our playbook is going to help you clarify your ask on a specific topic, but you're not going to open up ChatGPT. You're going to open up Microsoft Word or something like it, and you're going to build your prompt using the major factors that we talked about. And then once you prompt it, you start to see how it responds. This prompt here, it even actually kind of shocked us in the response that it gave, because it confirmed for us that it understands exactly what it is that we're trying to do. It really just kind of, just like an analyst oftentimes speaking to an executive would, right? You echo back. It echoed back for us what the factors were, right? And what it actually did is it took us up on the offer of asking us follow-up questions. And that is already now, you're in a completely different ballpark now when it comes to value, right, of that you're getting from AI, because it is now starting to behave like an analyst, right? Sure, I'll give you essentially the ChatGPT's attitude here is that, yeah, I understand what you're asking for, but let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions so I understand a couple of the factors a little bit better so that I can give you a better response, right? That's exactly what it's done for us here. And it says, for example, hey, if we're working on an agile project and we have a user story format, can you provide me more information about the role analysis process? What specific aspects of roles are you looking to analyze? Well, wouldn't you know it, that our playbook actually gives you some recommendations on aspects that we need to consider, right? And so now you're going back to your original analytical thinking, experience, guidance, training to give it what it wants so that it can do your job for you. I'm hoping that you're starting to see the pattern of usage and the value of separating these steps in the way that we have been. So if you were to look at that response, right, what it has essentially done is regurgitated. It has asked us the follow-up questions. And as part of this, when we saw this, we really knew that we kind of had designed our prompt really, really well. And that's when we were comfortable moving to the next step. And again, our next step wasn't to start typing right in ChatGPT. If I was to actually pull up the document, you would see that I took all of the questions that it had and I started to go line by line and I started to give it answers to every single question that it had asked. So, hey, can you provide me with more information about the role analysis process? Absolutely. We want to understand the hierarchy of roles. We want a clear definition of the different roles that exist that you think exist inside of our company. How do these roles interact with the proposed CRM system that we're looking to implement? How do these roles interact with each other? How do these customer roles that are going to be around, how are they going to interact with I think that was a bit of a repeat. But regarding the gherkin format, we also gave it some guidance, essentially. So I won't go through all of it, but this role goal benefit format plus the Gherkin format for the acceptance criteria is what we chose for this example. And again, we could essentially walk through the entire thing here, the entire conversation, but hopefully by this point, you've already understood what the value of this is. Okay. And if you are interested in the conversation, there is this link right here where you can actually go through and it'll open it up in a ChatGPT window for you and ask you if you want to continue this conversation yourself. And this link, I'll show you. You don't have to copy this down or anything like that. We've created a page on our website where you can actually just go and click on that, and it'll open it up in a ChatGPT window for you and take it for a spin. We've made both of our prompts available to you at both the early prompt that I showed you with the risky one and this one. So don't worry about having to copy any of the URLs or anything like that. Keeping an eye on the time and making sure that we have time for answers, I'll try to wrap this up a little bit more quickly with step number 6. A few tips for step number 6, integrating it into your work. Once you've done all of your refinement and all of your iteration, a few things you should consider at this point. Our guidance at this point is that you have to make sure that you adopt a mindset of less is better, right? It's less is better is the mantra of one of my favorite architects who architected a lot of the buildings in Chicago and New York and in Toronto. But his mindset was that we need to strip things down to their basic form, and we have to make sure that we have function, right? And this is an architect's way of designing really modern, minimalistic architecture. You have to adopt that mindset as well for your work. Lean deliverables. Just because you have text doesn't mean you incorporate it into your work. Strip out everything that does not fit. Okay. A lot of junior analysts sometimes kind of have this mindset where they think, okay, well, if I produce a lot of content, it might seem like if I produce a lot of content, it might seem like I've done more work. That's not true. It's the total opposite. The more you can summarize and distill your work, the better it is across everybody, because distilled, summarized work is what has true impact. Okay. Second tip that we have here is that you have to make sure that there's an alignment between the language that's used specifically inside of your own company and the work that you're producing, because things will very quickly start to look like they're out of place, or it'll be very obvious that you've basically just cut stuff out of AI and pasted it into your work deliverables if you don't make the necessary adjustments to fit it into the language that your company uses. And every company has a very specific lexicon that nobody really defines for you. Just by the nature of you being inside of a company, you start to learn the way that people speak and the way that people refer to certain things, certain concepts, important concepts within their business. You have to make sure that you create that alignment, because again, ChatGPT may not necessarily have that context. It usually doesn't, unless you've really baked it into your prompts, and unless you've really kind of refined and iterated your prompts. You're going to have to do some extra work, even when after all of those iterations, to make sure that the quality of your work material, as soon as somebody reads it, it doesn't look like it was generated by somebody who doesn't understand the inner workings of your company. Tip number 3, bit smaller tip, but your personality matters, whether you believe it or not, right? A lot of folks who get into larger companies tend to think that they have to completely shed their own personality out of everything, and that's not a good way to operate. Okay, you have to be respectful, you have to be professional at all times, of course, but people like dealing with people, and that doesn't change with AI. And so you have to make sure that you don't let the robot speak on your behalf. And this may not be as relevant for the deliverables, but if you're using ChatGPT to help you communicate, this starts to become a very big thing, because you want to make sure you're not speaking in a robotic tone that doesn't reflect your personality, right? There is oftentimes people kind of, I find, get a little bit confused if they see that your emails have a certain tone, but when you speak to them in person, it's a totally different tone. There's a bit of a disconnect there, right? And a robot like ChatGPT, which it is still a robot, that can magnify or widen that gap between, you know, who you really are as a person versus how you come across by using AI. And so you have to make sure you don't let it do that, because it might seem like a small thing, but your personality is an important part of building relationships that is a critical part of you being able to get effective work done, right? And so you have to make sure that the robot doesn't strip all of that stuff out as you're starting to use it. We are at 45 minutes after, and so I think we were, I might be a couple of minutes over. It looks like we do have some questions.
Yes, we have. First of all, excellent presentation. I love it. Thank you. So we have some 5 questions, I think. The first one is, as a BA, comes an urgent task to get prepared for the workshop with a group of stakeholders for tomorrow. And I still need some time to dive into the context. Do you think ChatGPT can help me here in some way to speed up the process? It seems that continuous evaluation and refining may take quite a considerable time.
Okay. So, can you read that first part of the sentence? I'd like to get an understanding of what it is that they're trying to do.
As a BA comes an urgent task to get prepared for the workshop with a group of stakeholders for tomorrow.
Yes. Okay. So I would say that use the tool as best as you can, but try to incorporate as much of what we're saying. You may not be able to iterate, but keep in mind, the key thing to keep in mind here is that you don't want to, especially when you're running a workshop, especially if it's a workshop that's in person, you don't want folks to think that the robot is doing your job for you. I think that might be probably one of the bigger risks. Unfortunately, AI is not a substitute. If I was to go back to share this slide here, right? If it is not a substitute for our jobs. So you can use it to the best of your abilities, but if you're under a time squeeze, it might help you a little bit. It won't do your job for you, unfortunately. So I appreciate the fact that that's actually our first question, because in our AI playbook, that is one of the requests that have been made for us to explore best practices around using ChatGPT for workshops. So that's something for you to look forward to in the future. I'm afraid I can't help you necessarily for your workshop tomorrow if that's a real workshop.
Okay. So other question. How often had you run over a case when the prompt you created based on the guide you talked about initially didn't need any further clarification and you got an acceptable result right from the start?
How often did I get an acceptable result without having to go through the process that we've recommended? Never yet. So I would say that, and that's part of the reason why we started to build this out, because I'll tell you that I'm not immune to some of these things that we talked about. The reason why we understand that there is this Google mentality is because I went through this process myself. And so I went into it with the exact same mindset. I said, we have ChatGPT now. It's going to solve our problems for us. I learned the hard way that it doesn't. And so the answer to the question very specifically is that it never has. And so we're now starting to build, as we learn how to use it for our own work as business analysts, we're starting to build out these best practices.
And another question. Are there still any BA tasks that could be done faster without using language models by the BA himself? Or do such tools from now on should be considered as an eternal partner through BA activities?
I think that I would say the second one. I would say that the way that I think about it is that I can do my job well without the help of AI. but I can add a lot more value if AI is sitting there as a trusted advisor and I know how to leverage it. Now, in the short run, you might think that I can do my work just fine without the help of AI. In the long run, what's likely going to happen is that there's going to be a set of analysts who basically have an unfair advantage over another set of analysts because of the fact that they are leveraging AI, right? And so in professional sports, for example, some people will use steroids to cheat. Think about it the same way, except it's not really cheating. It's available to everybody. It's just a matter of who chooses to adopt it. So do you want to be a massive high performer 5 years from now? If the answer is yes, you don't have any other choice but to use AI.
Okay. Now in our page of YouTube, how to understand when to split and what is remembered out of several chunks.
Splitting user stories, is that the question? Is how do we know when to split a user story?
I think it's when I understand that you are explaining to us to write a Word document with all the steps that we need, but sometimes there are some limitations on the software, so we have to split it in several. I think is this that the person is asking.
So the question is steps for how to split our prompts. Okay. So I would say that a pattern that works really well is try to give it as much as possible until you hit the character limitations, and then ask it, are you ready for me to share further details? And typically what it'll do is it'll split your response up, and ChatGPT will absorb what it is that you've shared with it, and it'll normally respond. I believe we had that in here. We didn't magnify it, but we have. I have numerous examples where I've had to split my prompts up. The way I typically do it is I put the first part of my prompt and I say, I have more to share with you before you respond. Are you ready for the next part? And it'll say, yes, please tell me more. And I'll continue to do that until I fed it everything that I need to. Oftentimes I'll say, do you have any follow-up questions on what I just told you before I share with you the rest of what I need to share? And so again, you see that the tip of using ChatGPT like a trusted advisor and speaking to it like a human becomes a massive tip. So imagine you're just speaking to a person, right? Instead of just giving them a brain dump of everything that you're looking for, imagine you're speaking to a person. How much information can they absorb? Start working with it in that way and see if that works for you.
Thank you. Another one. How can we understand when to stop if evaluation of the prompt doesn't bring any results?
The shortest answer to that question lies in here and in here. How do you know? This is the eternal question for every business analyst. When are your requirements done? Right? It's the exact same question. The answer is that there are factors that determine that, right? And so typically you have time frame. So if you give me a year to do requirements, I'm going to take a year to do very, very good requirements. Chances are I probably have about 50 to 60% of the time that I actually need to do my job. So time starts to become a constraint. How do you start evaluating? Is you have a time constraint. That's probably one of the biggest ones that's going to affect you, because again, it's the exact same question as when are my requirements done? A lot of this evaluation that we do is very similar to us evaluating our work or evaluating the work of one of our peers. When is it done? Well, it has enough value to move to the next stage. And determining that level of value, unfortunately, takes experience and judgment. So you have to go through the process. And you'll eventually build up an instinct to say, no, this is good enough. And that instinct is essentially what experience is. Experience is basically you building up a set of instincts that work really well. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that one.
And we have a curious question here. Remember when we have a question about how many times that you have a result, a good result, acceptable result right from the start. Mm-hmm. Now we have another question that is, and what about the result with the usage of that steps that you described? How often the result was acceptable after applying these steps?
I would say probably a good 80% of the time we get the results that we want. And so if you remember earlier when I talked about trustworthiness is low, your success rate with using AI increases dramatically with how well you structure these steps that we talked about. So for example, when I first started to talk, I told you the trustworthiness is here. And if you recall, I had said that there's a way for you to boost the trustworthiness of these sources. Applying these principles just increases the chances. And so we've kind of, if I have to estimate, I'd say a good 80% of the time we're getting almost exactly what we need. Or we bring it up to a point where we realize this has just saved me 2 days worth of work in an hour and a half of using this. I'm going to take it from here, right? But the practices are what help you to increase the quality of information you're going to get, and that increases the trustworthiness of the source. So short answer is 80%, but a longer answer is everything depends on how well you adopt these practices.
All right, thank you. We have almost out of time, but I have one more question here. That is, what's next? What's your opinion for the future of AI?
We think if you saw this icon right here, the Copilot icon, that is the tool that we think has even more potential than ChatGPT for business analysts. And the reason why we believe that is that Copilot has advertised the ability to train unique models for an actual organization. So a company that adopts Copilot can train the machine on its own set of information that it has inside of their Microsoft products. And that now opens up the ability for you to start asking very detailed questions, such as, the use case I'm looking forward to is I want to be able to go to Copilot for a specific company and say, based on the current company's operating procedures, explain to me how they onboard a new employee based on their procedures specifically. And Copilot, having been trained on that data set, which is the procedures and everything else that it has access to, will give me now a much unique response. And essentially what that does is it cuts my current state analysis time down significantly. And now I can start focusing on the future state because the information that I would normally have to dig through as part of my current state analysis is now much more easily accessible. So that's a specific use case that we have our eye on. And so Microsoft Copilot, I believe, is our next major thing that we're looking for. But if you want more info on this, bablocks.com/AI is where we publish our latest findings. So even these findings yet have not been published there yet. So you guys are the first ones to hear a lot of the guidance that we're giving today.
Okay, thank you, Emal. It was a very, very good presentation. We all learn a lot. And I want to share with with the persons that are seeing us, that please leave us your feedback. Your opinion is important for us. And
if you don't mind, Francisco, I'd just like to make sure that there is a time-sensitive resource that we have available that closes July 13th for anybody who wants to learn. I just want to make sure that you have access to all of these resources as well if you're trying to learn the profession and everything else. There is time-sensitive resource, but if you go to bablocks.com/resources, you'll there's a ton of other stuff that you can learn about how to actually do this job really well. So I'll just kind of leave that there with you as well.
Okay. Thank you, Emal. Thank you all. Please join us tomorrow for the second day of this BA Excellence Conference, and we'll have more 6 presentations, very good ones also. So see you tomorrow. Have a really nice day. Thank you, Emal.
Take care, everyone.
Bye bye.